Hi there and welcome. We've been having a few questions about the armhole shaping on the Pemberton pullover, and so I thought I would just do a little bit of video here to explain how to work a pattern stitch and armhole decreases at the same time. So as you can see on my Pemberton pullover, I have just completed the bind off stitches on both sides of my pullover. So on the pattern size that I'm working on, I had to bind off 6 stitches at the beginning of the last 2 rows. So I bound off 6 stitches on the knit side, worked my way across. I bound off 6 stitches on the wrong side, worked my way back, and now I'm back at the for the right side facing. And at this point it says in the pattern to continue working in moss stitch and to work in the established pattern while shaping the armhole. So I need to do 2 things here at this point. I need to work in moss stitch and I need to shape the armhole at the edge. And the shaping the armhole requires doing some decreases. So for the next row of my pattern, and it says for all sizes, work the decrease row in and then the established pattern. So for this we're going to knit 2 stitches to begin with. This is the selvage stitch and then 1 more stitch. And then it says to work an SS decrease, an SSK decrease. To do an SSK decrease, you will slip the next 2 stitches one at a time as if to knit. Then you insert the tip of your left hand needle into the front of those 2 slipped stitches and you knit them together. That's an SSK decrease. So I've done that, and now I'm going to work in the established pattern, but I haven't really established it yet. So I'm going to go over to the moss stitch pattern, and in the Pemberton pullover pattern stitch patterns, it says to work a selvage stitch in the moss stitch, but of course we've already worked that selvage stitch over here, and then we work the decrease. So now I'm just going to begin the moss stitch pattern as it's written for row 1, which is knit 2, purl 2. So I'll knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, and I'm going to do that all the way across the back of my sweater until I get to the last 4 stitches, because on this decrease row that I'm working on it says work in the established pattern to the last 4 stitches. Okay, so you can do this too. You're just going to knit 2, purl 2 across that row, and when I get to the last 4 stitches I'll stop and I'll show you what's happening next. So I'm at the last 4 stitches of my row 1, which is the decrease row, and the last 4 stitches are knit 2 together and knit 2. Okay, so that's no problem. You can do that, and then you're going to turn your work and we're going to work the next row, and we're just going to repeat these 2 rows, the decrease row and the next row, for a certain number of times. So on the next row it says to purl 3 and then work in pattern to the last 3 stitches and purl 3. So we'll purl 3, that was the knit 2 and the decrease on the other side. Okay, now here's the secret to moss stitch. When you're working on the wrong side, you're going to knit above the knits and purl above the purls. So when you look at your stitches, if you see a little bit of a loop underneath the needle, then that's a knit stitch. If you see a bump underneath the stitch on the needle, that's a purl stitch. So when I'm working the wrong side, you want to work the knits on top of knits and purls on top of purls. And then you don't have to worry about following the instructions in the pattern as long as you remember to read your knitting. If you can't notice, if you have a hard time recognizing a knit stitch, that's okay, everybody does. It's much easier to recognize a purl stitch. So if I forgot where I was here, I could just look ahead on my knitting, and if I'm not sure what this stitch is, I look at the next one and I can tell that's a purl stitch because of its very distinctive bump underneath the stitch. So if that's a purl stitch, this must be a knit stitch. It doesn't have that bump. So knit the knits, purl the purls, and work your way across that next row, across the wrong side, doing that. Knit the knits, purl the purls, until you have only 3 stitches remaining in the row. Okay, I'll meet you at the end of the row. Okay, so when you get to the end of the row, this is the wrong side row again, you're just knitting above the knits, purling above the purls until you get to the last 3 stitches, and then it's always purl, purl, purl. And that's one set of decreases completed. And it says to repeat the last 2 rows the number of times that you need for your size. In my case, that's 8 more times, and it tells me what the stitch count will be when I've done that. So let's do this right side row again. Okay, so on the right side row, it's always going to be a decrease row. So I'm going to begin with knitting 2, 1, 2, and then a slip, slip, knit, decrease. So the slip, slip, knit, decrease is slip 1 stitch as if to knit, slip 2 stitches as if to knit, insert the tip of your left hand needle into the front of those 2 slipped stitches, and knit them together. Now, when I did this decrease, I ate into my moss stitch pattern by 1 stitch, but that's okay because I know that the pattern is very regular. Now on a right side row, I remember on a wrong side row, you knit above the knits and you purl above above the purl. So on the right side row, we do the opposite. You're going to purl above a knit and knit above a purl. So again, sometimes it's easiest to find the purl stitches on your needle, and I can see that these 2 stitches here are purl stitches because they have that distinctive purl bump below them. So this one here must be a knit stitch. So on the right side, I'm going to purl above a knit stitch. So I'll bring my yarn forward and purl that stitch and take my yarn to the back and knit above the purl stitches. Now it doesn't matter if your pattern starts out the same as mine or different from mine, that's okay. On the right side rows, to do the moss stitch, on the right side rows you're going to knit above the purls and purl above the knits until you get to the last 4 stitches, and then you're going to do a decrease. So on the right side rows, knit above the purls, purl above the knits, and I'll meet you at the end of the row. So here I am, I'm almost at the end of my decrease row, so I'm doing my purl above my knits, and I can do 1 knit above the purl, and then I have 4 stitches left. So regardless of where I am in my moss stitch pattern, I'm going to stop here when I have 4 stitches left and knit 2 together, and then knit the last 2 stitches. And that's the decrease row. Then turn it over, and we're going to do a work-in pattern, kind of plain row in a sense, no decreases on this side. So with the wrong side facing, I purl the first 3 stitches, and then look at the next stitch, and what do we do on the wrong side? We do the same stitch above the stitch. So on the wrong side here I see 1 purl stitch, and if I'm not quite sure I can look ahead. I think those are knit stitches, and these are definitely purl stitches over here. So if these are purls, then these are knits, and that's a purl. So on the wrong side, you're going to purl above the purls and knit above the knits. And you can continue on doing this on either side. So on the wrong side, you work the same stitch above the stitch, and on the right side, you work the opposite stitch across on top of the stitch. So on the wrong side, knit above the knits, purl above the purls, and on the right side, knit above the purls and purl above the knits. And you'll keep your moss stitch together while you create those decreases at the side. and you won't have to worry too much about the patterning as long as you remember to read your knitting. But that's just my little advice for working the decreases along the side of the armhole while you work the moss stitch pattern at the same time. Okay, keep going everybody.